name is Jim Nitterauer. Thanks for coming today. So how's Derbycon treating you? Like it so far? All right, now it's like getting to be close to 5 o'clock on Saturday. I need a little more than that. Come on, get a little excited now. It's the weekend, right? All right. So I'm a senior security specialist at AppRiver. Before we get started, I'm going to go over the standard disclosures. You can all read that and agree to that. There's nothing in this talk that's going to give you any insight into how to break things or do any damage to anybody. So first, a little about me. I've been with AppRiver for over 10 years. I've started 2 different IT companies. I've spoken at a multitude of InfoSec events. I've been at NobleCon this year. I had the pleasure of speaking at DEF CON, so that was quite an experience. Imagine a room with 3,600 people in it. That was quite fun. I'm on staff at B-Sides Las Vegas, the president of the Florida Panhandle chapter of ISC Squared. Today's talk is a little bit different than most talks that I give. Usually I get pretty technical and I like people to walk away with an idea of how to better secure their networks. One of the topics that's been coming up in the Twitter feeds and things like that are people talking about having degrees in InfoSec, not having degrees in InfoSec. Do I need a degree? Do I not need a degree? You suck because you have a degree. You're no good because you don't have a degree. That's all flying around, right? So we're going to talk about one person's experience, my experience, how I got from where I started to where I am today. And maybe you can see that not every path has to be the same. It's a matter of where we're going and not how we get there sometimes. There's also not going to be a lot of words on my slides. So sit back, relax, take a trip with me down memory lane as I go through some of the milestones in my career in transitioning from a microbiologist into the field of InfoSec. So you might ask, why did I come up with this talk? Been reading a lot of Kevin Mitnick's books lately. I got to meet him at RSA conference. I've seen him at a couple different conferences around. One of the books he has out is called The Art of Deception. Anybody have any idea what year that book was written? Close. 2002. 15 years ago. So as I was reading that book, he was going over a lot of the same things that we're seeing happen today. The very thing that happened with Equifax, not patching your systems. The very things we're seeing with social engineering. A book written 15 years ago, and we're still making the same mistakes. When I was looking through this, I looked at a quote by George Santayana. It says, in his writing, he says, when experience is not retained as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I'm a bit older than most of you guys here. So I've got a little bit more experience from back when, before the internet. I was around before the internet, okay? That's how far back I go. So today's slides are going to not be too many words, but basically what happened was I grew up kind of like this guy. I lived on a farm in Pennsylvania. I spent my time hunting, fishing, and my goal was to go to veterinary school. So I picked out a college to where I could get prepared to get into veterinary school. I knew what I needed to do, wanted to get there. So I took a shot at it. What came out of the ground was not exactly what I expected. So Rod Sterling said there's a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It's the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of a man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of our imagination. It's an area in which we call the twilight zone. So the twilight zone is our imagination. What can we imagine happening? Well, my introduction to computer technology happened in high school. Anybody know what this thing is? What it's called? There's a name for it, though. Begins with an H. It's a Hollerith card, named for the code that was invented in 1896, I believe, for encoding digits in rows and columns by holes in paper. But in any case, these are 80 characters per card. Now, when we programmed, this is what we programmed in first. We would get a machine, we would sit there and we would type in our program, it would generate these punch cards, we would run this punch card over to a stack reader, that stack reader would then read all of these cards and run the program. Now can you imagine debugging this? Just for reference, a single 16 gig micro SD card holds 199,993,433 of these cards. That's 99,000 boxes of 2,000. So when we do programming, if you were to make a mistake, let's say you had 1,000 of these cards. You notice something that's missing from these cards? there's no number. You don't know where they fit in the stack, right? So you're walking down the hallway, somebody bumps into you, knocks these cards out of your hand. What do? You got to go reprint the whole stack. You get halfway through a program, there's something off by a byte. You got to reprint everything below that to run it through the machine. So this is where I started. This was why I didn't want to get into computers when I started in the field. When I started looking for a career field. So this is the machine that we would use to type up these cards. It's got a key punch, and the cards would slide on through, and it would put the program onto the cards. They would come out on the other side in a stack. Then you would carry them over to the computer. It would read through a stack reader and then load the program into the computer. So we got lucky at our school. How many remember these computers? The Trash 80 computers, right? From Radio Shack or Tandy Corporation. Our school got lucky. We had these things in our school, and this is the first thing I learned to program on. There was this little company out of New Mexico that created this language called BASIC. BASIC Level 1, BASIC Level 2. Anybody know the company? Nobody knows that company. You all know that company, and you hate their guts. It was Microsoft. That was the first product that they ever developed. They developed Pascal first. Bill Gates wrote the compiler for BASIC Level 1 and Level 2. The third release of BASIC was Disk BASIC. So these computers did not have disks at the time. The ones we had at our high school, we stored our programs on cassette tapes. The cassette tapes were labeled with our name, put in a plastic box, and put on a shelf. That was our security. That's how we stored our programs. Along came later the 5 1/4 inch disc. Those discs held, anybody want to guess? They held 85 kilobytes of data, the first release. The computer itself only had 48K of memory. Now, think about that. You can only write a program, including everything else that's running in memory, has to be smaller than 48K to be able to run. Anybody out there can do that today? Probably not, right? You had to program very elegantly. So, later on in that year, in 1981, a little company called IBM undertook a project called the Project Chess. This was back before PCs were on the market. People at IBM went and they talked with Bill Gates about licensing their programming languages, but they also didn't have an operating system. They had worked with several different companies. There was a company called Digital Research that had developed an operating system that was used on the Tandy machines, but they didn't want to use that because of the cost factor. IBM was going to try and get this to market so it was a consumer grade so a lot of people could buy it. So they met with Bill Gates and kept asking for an operating system. Bill Gates kept referring him to a company called Digital Research. Digital Research had a product called CP/M. A guy named Gary Kildall, think of that name, Kildall, worked with IBM, and he was the guy that was at Digital Research. IBM offered them a non-disclosure agreement to use their DOS product on the IBM PC. Kildall said, no, I don't like the agreement. IBM walked away. Paul Allen worked with Bill Gates, and they came across this guy named Tim Patterson. He had built a very rudimentary 8086-based computer and written the first DOS-based program. First DOS-based was called QDOS. Anybody know what that stands for? Bingo! Quick and Dirty OS. That was the first version of DOS ever written. Allen made an agreement with him to pay him and his company, SCP, $15,000 for every licensed copy of QDOS, plus a $10,000 commission for every other company they sold it to. Within a couple of years, Allen had gone to him. He had come over to Microsoft and bought all of DOS for $50,000. They sold their first round to IBM for $460,000, and the rest is history. That put IBM out of business because when IBM sold, or not IBM, it put Tandy out of business because when they sold these computers, they were able to sell DOS for about $40. The other operating system sold for $240, so there was no way for Tandy to compete. In my college days, we ended up doing some programming, and I took a minor in computer programming while I was working on a degree in biology. And we had to work on these fine machines. Anybody know what this is? VAX 1170, right? So these are mainframe computers. Everything was stored locally. You had terminals that you would connect to. We programmed in our classes. We had classes in Fortran and Pascal. Anybody ever program in Fortran? Pain in the ass, isn't it? Fortran is a formatted, meaning a column formatted language. So your lines, your line numbers, certain characters had to be in column 2, certain in 3, certain in 4, and certain in 5. And if you were off by one character in any of that compile, you had to rerun all of your code, recompile. It was kind of really a pain in the butt to work with. But it was a fun, strictly formatted language. So I also got lucky, and the biology department where I was going to school had a couple of these fine little devices. These are, this is an Apple IIe, I believe. These devices, they had them in there for teaching. The teachers were supposed to use them as a way to quiz students and help them grow in learning biology. Well, our teachers had them. They didn't know what the heck to do with them. So they handed them off to the college students, me at the time young, and the young people had to teach the teachers how to use the computers. So that was part of my exposure there as well. So while that was going on, I'm studying to get my degree in biology, applying to veterinary school, doing all the things I need to do to follow that path. In the meantime, there's this guy named Michael Dell. He was taking a different approach at UT in Austin. He started putting together computers in his dorm room and selling them. Within 2 years, he went from selling them out of his dorm room to an 82,000 square foot warehouse and factory in Austin, Texas. During that time, several other competitors came into the market. Compaq was probably the first one to offer PCs, but their initial focus was on suitcase computers, and I'll show you one of those here coming up, as I used one of those during some time later in my graduate studies. But during this time, Dell was the main leader in that. Gateway came along shortly thereafter. Hewlett-Packard had always sold PCs, but never in the consumer market. And then Packard-Bell came along later, and that brought about the proliferation of PCs in the consumer market. Now, the internet wasn't a thing in 1980. Nobody knew what the internet was, right? You had BBS services. CompuServe had been around, I think, since 1969. If you bought, like, who remembers a Timex Sinclair computer, right? That was one of the first ones out there. Or the Commodore 64. I think they actually had a Commodore 32 before that. Didn't go very far. But they all came with CompuServe and a couple other BBS services that you could actually dial into and use. The problem with those services was most small towns didn't have local phone numbers to dial into. So young people today don't understand what long distance is, right? When we grew up, you had a local number that you could dial, you had an extended local number, which was called a LATA, and then you had long distance calls that you could make. Anything in your local exchange was a free call. You would pay a little extra for calls within that LATA and a lot more per minute when you made long distance calls. So if you had to dial, say, CompuServe, and they're not in your town, you could rack up hundreds of dollars a month in long distance charges just because you're online dialing these things. So in 1980, the connection to the computer network protocols wasn't around, but the idea behind the Ethernet protocol was developed by a man named, anybody know? Robert Metcalf. There's another old guy in the room. Robert Metcalf developed that. He worked with David Boggs, Chuck Thacker, Butler, Lampson, and another fellow at Xerox PARC. And a side story, the Xerox PARC, anybody know what else that's famous for? Who else went there and stole some ideas and built a computer that I showed you 2 slides earlier, right? Xerox PARC is where that was developed. It was in a basement warehouse, and they showed them this mouse and a graphical screen, and from there they went on and built the Apple computer. So Xerox Corporation was central in the development of a lot of these technologies, but they really weren't the winner in the market share. So 3Com worked. Metcalf left Xerox in 1979 to form a company called 3Com. This was the first networking company. They worked with DEC, Intel, and Xerox to promote the first Ethernet standard in 1980, and they published a paper on that. In 1983, it was adapted as the Ethernet protocol, or the Ethernet standard that we know of as the 802.3, and that was in 1983. So who knows what the first formal standard was called in that paper that they published? It's called DICS, for Digital Equipment Corporation, IBM, and Xerox. So the internet was founded on a bunch of dicks. I thought that was funny, but 1984, another little player came into the game, and their initial logo's down there in the bottom. That was the Cisco Corporation. They were founded in San Francisco, California. So the Ethernet was originally token ring or token bus done over thin net cable or thick net cable with BNC connectors. After that, in 1981, the first 10 megabit Ethernet card became available. They were mostly used on servers at that time, like the VAX, those kinds of systems. And PCs were able to get network cards in 1982. And the market share grew a little bit at that point in time. My mouse is gone. There it is. So, Ethernet on untwisted pair cable, like what we use today, started out with a star LAN. It started out as 1 megabit per second in the mid-1980s. And in 1987, Synoptics introduced the first twisted pair Ethernet cable at 10 megabits. And they created a star topology with a centralized hub. And that's when Ethernet, as we know it today, started to become proliferated in the marketplace. And that's where it became affordable for small businesses to start networking their devices. So, this standard was published in 1984. Anybody know what it is? Everybody in this room should know what it is, but if when I tell you, you'll know what it is. This is the standard for the Open System Interconnect model, or the OSI model. This was ratified in 1984. Without this, networking protocols wouldn't work. Things wouldn't be able to talk to one another, right? And there's what that is. So in 1985, I finished with my degree in biology, and I moved to this town. I didn't get accepted into veterinary school. Veterinary school is very difficult to get into. It's much like medical school, only harder. There were at the time only 24 schools in the country. They accepted about 100 students, but you had to have strict residency requirements. So in my case, I lived in Pennsylvania. There were really only 3 schools I could apply to. 2 of them were Ivy League, and 3.5 grade at point average wasn't quite good enough. So I decided to move to where I could make some money at a job. A friend of mine told me about a job in Las Vegas. I went out there and worked and applied to graduate school. While I was out there, this is just an interesting picture. I don't know if you can see. This picture is actually from 1985. Wrong button. There we go. Right here, that hotel, that's Bally's, where Defcon was, not this year, but last year. This is 1985. This whole area here is where Mandalay Bay is. This is where the new MGM is. So you can see Las Vegas was quite different in 1985 when I lived there. It was easy to get across the strip at that point in life. So I worked out there. I worked for a laboratory called Lockheed. We worked on the EPA's National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, where we ran a lab out there and took samples in and shipped them off to other labs. In the meantime, I applied to graduate schools, got accepted to a bunch of them. I went to this one because they had a good football team and they gave me the most money. So now that's how kids make choices, right? Went there and worked for 3 years in the microbiology department. But during that time, I had to write a thesis, a master's degree. This was a research thesis, so I had to put that together. When I was there writing my thesis, this was my best friend. How many of you have ever tried to type up a paper on a typewriter? Yeah. How many liked that experience? Now, can you imagine doing a blog post every day on a typewriter and having to submit it, right? So this thing became my best friend. This, I believe it was a compact computer. The screen on it was like 9 inches or something. But it was great for me because I could sit there and type up my thesis, and it basically, you put the disk in one side and you put your storage of where you're putting your files on the other. You ran WordPerfect off the floppy disk. It loaded in memory. You typed up your paper, saved it. And I would take an extra copy with me because I was paranoid. I didn't want to lose the disk. I didn't trust them. These were kind of new, and I didn't know what could happen to them. Discs are very sensitive compared to CDs. So I worked there until 1989. 1991, they published some of my research in this FEMS Journal of Microbiology. I've got several other publications out there. In 1989, I went on to a summer job in Washington, D.C. area, and then later that year, I got transferred to this location, the U.S. EPA in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Anybody know what this is a picture of? Yeah, Exxon Valdez oil spill, right? That happened in March of 1989. Second largest oil spill in continental United States ever. But, here's a question for you. You know how many captains it takes to steer the Exxon Valdez through the Prince William Sound? 1 1/5. that's what the EPA does for you, right? You learn all these great things. So the laboratory where I was working was doing some environmental studies on this. They had been up there doing work before I came down to the laboratory. The laboratory was studying how bacteria degrade components of crude oil. So they would do really rudimentary experiments. They would take a patch of beach, divide it into sections with markers, put basically fertilizer on one side, leave the other side alone, and measure it over time to see how the bacteria destroy the oil. Because the other way they were cleaning it up, if you knew, they were taking paper towels and wiping the rocks by hand, putting the paper towels in plastic bags and shipping them to a landfill in Oregon. So that was really environmentally friendly. But anyway, the EPA is not always the smartest tools in the shed. So this picture taken from Sabine Island. This is near where Dave Kennedy went to school. I was in the Marine Corps for a little while, Corey Station near NAS Pensacola. But this island's kind of interesting because, it's an aside, it wasn't a natural island. From about the mid-1850s until the early 1920s, ships would come over from Europe. Well, those ships would come over empty. When the ships come over empty, they have to have ballast rock to keep the ship upright and low in the water so it can make the trip. But when they get here, then they have to dump that ballast rock somewhere and fill up with cargo and go back. So this was the dumping ground for all of the ballast, and it became Sabine Island. Really cool place. We used to go snorkeling around the island, do all kinds of fun stuff there. But I came to the party too late. I was working with a couple of guys that were doing a little bit more genetic research. My background was in molecular biology at the time. And we were studying how bacteria, the metabolic pathways for how bacteria degraded two different compounds, one isopropylbenzene and this fun little compound. It's called benzothiophene. It's a heterocyclic organic compound. It's called heterocyclic because it's not all carbons. It has a sulfur in it, and it's one of the components of crude oil. So what we would do is we would take bacteria that could eat this stuff, live off of it. We would break up their genes and find ones that accumulated intermediates in the metabolism of this, and then study how that worked. So through that, we would learn, for me, I learned the scientific method and the approach to figuring things out, right? So it's no different than hunting threats, right? It's no different than troubleshooting a network. It's really scientific methodology applied to a different setting. Uh-oh. We're just talking about you. What is this? Zebra. Cool. Take the enamel off my teeth. Thank you, sir. Yeah. I'll be up front. I'm not going to drink this whole thing. This tastes like a shitty Bartles and James. Woo! So, back to microbiology. This is where I really started to get into computers. And you think, well, computers. Well, what do you use computers for besides going on the internet, browsing whatever you browse, and hacking things, right? Well, there's a whole lot more than that. In our case, we were using all of these different devices to do our work. So we would accumulate all of these different intermediates in these metabolic pathways, but we had to be able to figure out what they were. So we would use things like, this is a spectrophotometer here, this is a gas chromatograph, the other one over there I think is a mass spectrometer, this guy down here is a nuclear magnetic resonance spectrophotometer, and this is a high performance liquid chromatograph. But all of them were connected to computers. And in this case, HP had the market cornered on those. These were all HP computers with specialized interfaces that read data from these different devices, and we could then use that data to draw our conclusions based on what we were trying to study. So, towards the end of my career, the EPA got very anal. I worked as a contractor to the EPA, and we were working in the same lab as EPA employees. Well, in come the lawyers. The lawyer said, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't have non-EPA employees in the same room with EPA people." So anyway, it became a big stink. Really turned me off about research. They wanted to keep me around. We had collected all of these, what we call in microbiology, clones. They're bacteria that have different genetic abilities. So they're like a bacterial species, subspecies, and then they're a strain that has a particular gene in them. Well, the lab had collected thousands of these different clones, and we had no way to keep track of them. So they came to me and said, well, we like you, want to keep you around. Can you create a database for us to put all this stuff in and keep track of it? So that was my first real introduction into computers and computer programming. They gave me a PC, this crazy Windows 3.1 operating system, which I had no clue how to use, and got me Paradox for Windows. So they said, put something together. So they stuck me in a room, and I learned how to use Windows. I learned how to use Paradox. I learned how to use databases. The cool thing was Paradox is a language called PAL, or I think it's Paradox Application Language, and the Windows version has something called Object PAL, which is really cool language. Just a little history. The guy that developed the language in Paradox and then went on to create Delphi, anybody know where he works now? No, he works for Microsoft, and he's the lead programmer on the C# project. So that's where he started. I think his name's Niels Borsland. It's a Norwegian name, and I don't remember his name exactly, but that's where you got to start, was doing this programming or developing these systems here for Borland. So anyway, I ended up working alone, developing databases, graphical interfaces, worked with researchers, tried to make all this happen. At the same time, I saw the writing on the wall. I was applying to PhD programs. I applied to Clemson. I applied to University of Illinois and University of Maryland. Got accepted at all of them. Then the EPA came back to me and said, well, we want you to come work for us. Now, at the time, I had a master's degree, and I was probably a GS 11 plus, somewhere up in there. They came back and offered me a 7 salary. So I told them to read between the lines and basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. But what ended up happening for me was that was a defining moment for me. I really realized that people didn't value scientific research. They valued their position, their esteem, and all that sort of thing. So I saw that I had this new thing, this new skill. I could use Windows. I could use a computer. I knew more about PCs than 100 people around me that had PhDs. So I took that and started doing some programming on the side for people, bought my own PC, stayed with them a little while. They put me on a postdoctoral fellowship for a while. Don't ask me why. They just said, we want you to stay. Put me in this postdoctoral position, which lasted 18 months. At the end of that 18 months, they basically said, yeah, we want you to stay, but now you have to go manage these people in this analytical chemistry lab. We had this one lab that the EPA employees had used to do PCB analysis over a very long period of time. And let's just say they were quite sloppy in how they did that. They used, I think there were 10 gas chromatographs in that room, all vented into the room. So the way a gas chromatograph works is you dissolve something in a solvent, inject it into this big coil, it goes through this oven. The coil has a substrate on it that separates out the compounds as they go along this coil, and as they come out on the other end, you read what comes out at various times. The problem is everything comes out and gets vented into the room, right? So then the solvents go away, and now you have a room full of PCB that's everywhere in the room, on the hoods, on the ceiling, on the cabinets, everywhere else. So they came to me and said, we want you to go work in there with these 3 women, 2 of which were pregnant. I said, I don't want to go work in there. I said, you have to. I said, no, I don't have to. I quit. So I ended up quitting the job, ventured out on my own, started doing some programming, bought a PC at home, and that's a paper that was published while I was at the EPA. Started getting involved in IT. One of the things I did was I opened up a remote backup service. People in our area wanted to keep their data, right? They had PCs, they had accounting programs, real simple stuff, but they had nowhere to store their data. So I bought into this remote backup program and did a bunch of odds and ends at my office to make that happen. Put in 4 phone lines, built a server. I'll go over how I did that in a second. But during my last years at the EPA, this internet thing became a big deal as well. So I saw the writing on the wall, and I made the choice to completely get away from science. I know I had a lot invested in my degree. I still had debt to pay. I still had student loans to pay off. But took a chance, went out on my own. Started doing all of this work. And at this point, the dial-up internet service business started taking off. Who remembers dial-up? Yeah, you would pay certain fee and have X number of hours per month. Most of you don't know dial-up when you had to go by the hour, right? So you would get a subscription. In our area, it was Gulf Coast Internet. They were the internet provider in the area. It was like $14.95 a month, and I think they gave you 8 hours a month. Can you imagine being on the internet for 8 hours a month? So you would compose your emails offline, save them into your outbox, connect, click a button, and it would send your messages, and then you would get offline. Because if you went over that, it was, some ridiculous $2 or $3 an hour for the time that you were over on that time. Well, the internet business was interesting to me because it was really growing. I thought, well, I could get in on this. I could do this. Then I started looking at the business model. Who remembers what happened during that time frame, right? What was the first modem speed that you remember working on the internet? 14.4, right? 9600, 14.4, that was pretty much typical speed. Well, within 3 years, what was the final speed? 56K, right? So now imagine yourself being an ISP. When you're an ISP, you would buy PRI lines incoming for your phone lines. So you would have 24 lines in a stack. So one PRI is 24 lines, 48, etc. So each one of those lines needs a modem coming in to answer that phone line. Well, those modems ran about $5,000 for a rack of 24. Now imagine that you bought that equipment, you're expecting to get a 3-year return on that equipment investment. But then suddenly the speed changes, and there's not a firmware upgrade to make that speed work. It's a swap the box, throw the box away, and put another box in the rack. Another 3 months goes by, and oh my God, there's a faster version, right? So this happened several times to the ISPs. Top that off with what happened in the industry. So the ISPs were making money, right? So their model works like this. A phone line would support typically 10 to 12 users. Each of those, let's say they're paying 15, I'm going to go use 20. So they're going to go 10 at $20. They're making $200 a month on each line. Their expenses might be $120. So they're making $80 profit. Add in the overages. It's a good business model. Well, these guys in the lower left, what did they do? Anybody remember? In December of 1989 maybe? No. Yeah, 1994, they went and did a change in their pricing model. They went from hourly rate to $19.95 unlimited. Now imagine that. You're an ISP, right? You want to keep up. You have to do something to differentiate yourself. I worked with several of these ISPs in Pensacola, and I told them, you have to do something different. You can't change your pricing. They all said, we're going to change our pricing to $19.95 unlimited. Well, at this point in time, I had put a server in one of these ISPs. I was doing some work with a company called iCat, which I'll talk about in a second, and AOL came and did all of this. So, at the same time, Netscape had become the de facto standard for internet browsing. There were several browsers that came out before this, but this was the big one. At the same time, when I was building my remote backup service, I wanted to use 4 modems on a serial card. Well, who remembers working with DOS? What was one of the problems you had when you were putting together a DOS machine with a lot of different interface cards? IRQ problems, right? It could only handle 2 interrupts at a time, typically, because you had a parallel port, a serial port, and maybe a modem, maybe a sound card. Well, not so. This little guy on the lower left, that's the first 32-bit operating system ever written for the PC, OS2 Warp. It was beautiful because you could spawn off 4 different DOS processes that were independent of each other, and they all could read the hardware separately. So what I did is I put my remote backup software on OS2, ran 4 different sessions of it, hooked it up to my card, my modems ran, everything was happy, everything worked. So that worked well, but the business didn't go as well as I had hoped. So what I ended up doing was creating a company called Creative Data Concepts and partnered with this iCat Corporation. Anybody ever hear of them? They were the first e-commerce providers ever in the market. There was no standardized scripting language. There was no standardized shopping cart. These were the guys that invented it. They were based out of Seattle, and they had a CGI-based system that worked either on Windows or on Linux. You could do it either way. And They were big into marketing because they had been in the business of generating catalogs for very large corporations, and they had like 6,000 customers. So for them to get those customers and convert them to an e-commerce platform, that was a big deal. They needed businesses to do that. So I got involved with that, started hosting some things at an ISP that was located in this building in downtown Pensacola, and grew my business from there. The remote backup business didn't go very well, but the ICAT business grew like crazy until the ISP I was with started changing its pricing model and saying, we're going to offer unlimited service for $19.95. They were already behind the 8 ball because they had swapped out all of their network gear 3 times over. Their pricing model was getting them, they went from a 10-to-1 user to modem ratio on the hourly rate. Guess how low it went? Went down to 3 to 1, 3 per modem. So 3 at $19.95 a month is $60. Costs $120 a month to run that line. There's 48 of those lines. The bleeding was pretty heavy and didn't stop, okay? They were absorbed by a local CLEC at the time, a local telephone company, and I saw the writing on the wall. So I ended up getting an office in this building and started my own web hosting company. I got away from the whole idea of doing an internet service provider and went to web hosting. So I ended up being one of the first web hosting providers in the entire Southeast, actually. We opened our doors in 1998, middle of 1998, in that office building. So what we did is we ended up getting a T1 line. That was our internet connection from a company called UUNet. I called them Screw UNet because it was the cost. Guess how much the cost for the T1 line was? $3,600 a month, just for one T1 line. So we got a T1 line, put in a rack of servers. These servers were HP servers. At the time, there was no such thing as a firewall. You bought a router or rented a router. You had a CSU, DSU card in it. There was no Ethernet, so you had a conversion between serial and packets on the card itself. So it was a little bit slower, a lot more latency. And then inside that, you had a 10 megabit Ethernet switch. There was no VLANs, there was no layer 3 switching, none of that stuff in that network. So we set up really what basically amounted to the first web hosting company. And this is where we started to learn a lot about security, right? Even back in those days, the web hosting companies were attacked pretty readily. So in our... Somebody's on my computer. So on our computers, we were using Windows NT, okay? At the time, you had to install this options pack to get IIS-4 on your Windows NT server. We chose this because this is what the ICAT software worked with. And also at the time, there was this company that used to make the basic language. Now they had, obviously, Microsoft, but they were putting out some other Office products, and one of those was Front Page. So we saw that that was going to be an option for us to make some really quick revenue in the hosting business. And they came out with this. Who remembers Front Page? Anybody still use Front Page? So on Front Page, you used to have to install these extensions on IIS, right? And then people could connect to you. They would have a username and password that would connect them directly to your web server and authenticate on that web server and let them publish their website from their computer to the web server. Now, the web servers, every one of the servers on the network at this time had an internet-facing IP. NAT was invented, but it wasn't pushed out yet because there were no firewalls that supported NAT at this point in time. So even the workstations in our office were internet-facing. So everything had an internet-facing IP. There was no security. The only security you had were basically some ACLs on the firewall or on the router at the edge. So we also added SQL Server support, and I started out with 6.5. And then we found this little scripting language. Anybody ever heard of Cold Fusion? Yeah. That was really secure, wasn't it? Great language because you could develop very rapidly with it. But there was no security thought into this at all, right? I don't know how many times we had SQL injection attacks and all different kinds of things that people could figure out pretty quickly. I mean, I'm talking like in 2000, we were seeing SQL injection attacks on our databases. They were either Access or SQL Server on these Cold Fusion websites. So we learned really quickly how to parameterize our queries, do all that sort of thing. Well, we also adopted one of the first coding methodologies called Fusebox. Anybody's heard of that? That's a pretty unique way. It's basically the whole MVC model has been broken down. It's what developed into the MVC model initially. So we were humming along until about 2001. I was meeting with some executives from Visit Florida, and we were going to be doing some work for them, and then this happened. And this is really when, in my mind, security became on everybody's radar, right? Physical security, but also network security, right? Because at this point, what are the three things we talk about in security? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? Well, this just wiped out A completely for everybody in those buildings, right? Availability was gone, done, finished. So in our realm, we started to see people wanting many, many more things. Well, what are you doing to protect your servers? What are you doing to protect our network? How is our data being backed up? What are you doing with that data? This is where we started to get a lot of questions about not only how do I host my website, but how do I host my website and do it safely and keep it secure? So the business kept growing, kept going well. We started implementing some other things. We did get the business from them. I ended up getting married in 2001, adopted 2 boys. Things were going well until about 2004. Then this little guy came along. His name was Ivan. Ivan hit on Wednesday, I want to say it was September 14th. 135-mile-an-hour winds pounded the Gulf Coast for 14 hours straight. This is one of the worst hurricanes that ever hit the Gulf Coast. Not a big deal, right? You would think. Well, problem was, in our business, people didn't really care much about you being in a data center and being up all the time. So we didn't have redundant power. We didn't have anything other than battery backups on our machines. And if you look at that bridge on the left, that's the I-10 bridge over Escambia Bay in Escambia County. There's a truck there that you can see. That truck drove by the hotel we were sheltering in at about 2:45 in the morning. He ran off that bridge and didn't know it wasn't there, and he didn't survive that fall. But this is what happened after Ivan. This is downtown Pensacola. That's the harbor near the pass. My office is at the time, our building, our data center is up the street here a little ways. So we didn't get a whole lot of damage. We're on the 3rd floor, but we didn't have any power. We were without power for over 17 days in downtown Pensacola. And this over here on this side, that was my house. So the front door, this is where the front door is here. That's 7 feet above sea level. The water was up there. That was water coming out of the sound. So everybody along the Gulf Coast that was anywhere near the edge of the water, their house was gone. It was devastated. It was an amazing event. So that got us to the point where I'm rebuilding, trying to find a house to live in, trying to get my family back together. I'm also president of one of the local chambers, helping them. But we're also getting customers saying, what are you doing? What's your plan? How are you going to fix this? How are you going to make sure this never happens again? So we were fortunate that across the hall from us, Sprint had built a data center. They built that data center back in '85. They were the telephone provider for Pensacola for AOL, CompuServe, and a whole bunch of other smaller networks. They abandoned that because long distance became so cheap they could do it centrally in bigger cities and not have to pay for their smaller outposts. They just left it. They just left this whole data center there. So we took over that data center, made an agreement with the landlord, converted it into a server-based data center, bought a generator, put in fiber rings, put in high-speed internet. At the time, we were OC3, 2 OC3 connections to the data center. That's since been upgraded to full 1 gig connections, and when I go back next week, we'll be upgrading full to 10 gig connections to that data center. But that gave us the ability to increase our redundancy and increase our reliability and availability way beyond what we had done before. So that helped us keep customers, helped us gain new business. Problem was web hosting then at that point became a commodity, so we had to adapt again. And what we ended up doing was we formed a new company. AppRiver came into being in 2002. In 2006, they saw an opportunity to help my company. And what we did is we started going out to these businesses that had been impacted by the hurricane and putting fiber into their building and leading them back to our data center. This gave them the ability to be in our data center, to have the uptime for their servers. We could feed them internet over that connection, and that gave them some assurance. And that was all well and good until 8, 9 years went down the road and there were no hurricanes, right? People are paying $1,500, $2,000 a month for their internet and data center. Why am I doing this? Well, now we know, right? It came back around this year. But things like that are cyclic. So we were able to do this with VMware and some other things, helping these customers grow their business. We were able to add some security. The company merged with AppRiver, got absorbed into AppRiver. I went on to their engineering team, and then we got thrown into doing data center changes for for AppRiver. So what we ended up doing, at one point, we were Rackspace's largest customer. The only one that was bigger than us now, or before we started to move, was EA Sports. Now we're not so much a big customer with Rackspace. But we've moved everything to Equinix data centers that we manage on our own. So the point is here, not what we did, but it's the skills that I had to develop to be able to do this, right? Remember, I went from being a microbiologist to somebody that's now moving servers in data centers around the world for a company that has 10 million mailboxes that they're filtering. So that's the change in that time frame for what I've been doing. So how did I get involved in InfoSec? Well, in 2013, I was encouraged to attend Derbycon by our CTO. I went and was like, holy shit, this place is weird. There's some strange stuff here. Yeah, I've come to accept most of it now, and I get it. At the time, I didn't, and that was my mistake, going to a conference that large before I went to something smaller, more intimate like this. So anyway, next year, I went to Derbycon again. 2015, somebody told me about this little conference called B-Sides in Las Vegas. So I showed up there, and I said, how much does it cost? They go, well, it's free. I said, what's the catch? Oh, you just have to get in line to get a badge. Okay, I got in line, got a badge, went to this conference. It was cool. But I had also gone to NOLACon that year, and I met a guy named Ben Miller. I don't know if anybody knows Ben. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, get your CISSP and get to know Jack Daniel. So that year at NOLACon, or at B-Sides, I met Jack. He probably doesn't remember at this point. And then worked on my CISSP and passed that last summer. But since I've gone to DEF CON every year, I'm now, I went to NOLACon in 2016 and spoke, and that gave me that was the first time I ever spoke at a conference. From there, I then applied to do the Proving Ground at B-Sides in 2016, which I got accepted, had Dave Lewis as my mentor, and met this guy up here in the vest here. Sciatic nerd. Good guy, by the way. Get to meet him. He's a great guy. And got to speak at B-Sides. From there, I went on and applied to speak at some other conferences. Basically, what I was doing was sharing information about what we did at AppRiver and how we did it. Met this crazy guy, Leonard, over here in this Graylog company, and then I used his tools and learned some things from him and learned from other people and gotten to meet literally hundreds of people in the process, right? So in this year, I was fortunate enough to be able to speak at DEF CON. So the point is, it's not what I've done, but it's how I've gotten from being a microbiologist, a biologist, to getting involved in InfoSec, right? So if you're in that path, anywhere in that path, you can do it. You don't have to be somebody that has a degree in InfoSec. You don't have to be somebody that follows a certain path that somebody else follows, right? If you're motivated, right? If you want to learn, there's plenty of people out there to help you. There's plenty of great people that know tons more than I do. I just suck up to them and learn from them, right? So, yeah. So now when I go back, this is the next phase, right? 2014, 2017. We took this old building where my office was in downtown Pensacola. It was on the 3rd floor above this. There's 10,000 square feet in this building. We've turned it from this into this, which is probably a state-of-the-art co-work space. Probably not one nicer in the entire Southeast. And what we've done, we've wired it up with 10 gig connectivity all throughout. There's 20 gigs of internet on the wireless through the place. Pretty phenomenal, right? So if you would ask me, would I be doing this in what would I be doing in 2017? When I was in high school, I would have said, probably out taking care of cats, dogs, horses, and pigs somewhere, right? Now, here's what I've been doing. This is another view of the building, another view of the location there. And this is my next project. When I get back, I have to move an entire data center from the space it is now over to this. That Sprint data center, they're tearing that building apart and putting in a hotel, so I have to move the whole thing. So that's my next challenge. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it, but I have complete confidence that I will get it done. Uh-oh. And I guess the moral of the story is, I don't know if you've seen the Back to the Future where they pull the note out of the pocket and Doc reads the note, right? And she goes, well, where's the writing on that note? And Doc says, your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it, so go out and make it a good one. And I guess the moral of the story is you can do whatever you want to do. All the stuff you hear on Twitter about having a degree, not having a degree, take that time that you would waste listening to that and doing all that crap, pick up a book, do something useful, and make yourself better, right? And become part of the solution, not part of the problem. Become one of those people that contributes. There's a lot of people in this room that I know that really contribute a whole lot to the community. And that's really what it's all about, right? We all have to get along. We heard the keynote on Friday, right? Why are we mean to each other? Why do we do these things? We all have our expertise. We are all very good at what we do. We can all work together to make the community better and make the world safer. So that's all I've got. But if you need to get a hold, I had to get the cat picture in there. So I don't know, the cat dressed up like Buzz Lightyear. So there you go. What a long, strange trip it's been. If I would have thought back to my life, how I got to this point, I never would have planned it like that. So you never know what life's going to hand you. So when it does, take it and run with it. Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming out.